Hey, what's up, everybody? Thank you so much for listening to the RomansTwelveOne Podcast. We would love it if you would go and like and subscribe whatever platform you're listening on to this podcast. That will help the algorithms just let other people know that they can find us, and they can also receive the information that we are sharing with you today. It's our goal to share generational wisdom with the next generation, and you can be a part of that by liking and subscribing wherever you listen to the RomansTwelveOne Podcast. Music is a language. And we speak the languages we know. And so I always thought it was odd that the language I would speak in this circle over here looked a lot different than the music language I spoke when I walked through the doors of a church building. What ended up happening is Grant and I sat right across from each other, and he began to speak to me about his, at that time, I think it was something that he was just trying to start, this More Than Music mentoring program, and really began to talk to me about his idea and his philosophy of worship. And as he's talking, I'm thinking, this guy's saying all the things that I think. That's that awesome. I've never heard anybody express it the way I express it until I met Grant.
I even struggle with the just an expression of worship, because my sense of the value of people of the Christian faith gathering together and singing prayers to him, to God, singing reminders of truth about God, praising God, encouraging each other to follow Jesus more intentionally, especially through songs. My assessment of the value of that as one of the expressions of worship is going up. To ascribe value to the cross of Jesus the Christ. In fact, the word worship used to be said worthship. Didn't exist in our English language as worship. That's about 300 years old, that use of it. So, and it used to only be a verb, worthship. And here's the thing. We are all constantly worthshipping stuff, things. There is a massive amount of confusion in the church about what it means to worship God on the first hand. And secondly, what is the role of music in a church gathering?
RomansTwelveOne Podcast. We are your hosts, Marty and Tim, father-daughter duo of the century.
I would beg anyone to find a better duo, father-daughter duo, than this right here.
They can try.
They can try.
No succeeds. Succeeds? I don't know what I'm saying. We're going to go jump right in, okay?
All right, let's do it.
We
can make up our own slang. Have you seen that guy on TikTok and YouTube, or not YouTube, I guess he does TikTok and Instagram, where he is a substitute teacher and he walks in and he gaslights all his students with his slang terms? Have you seen this?
No.
It's hilarious.
You would do that.
He literally goes in and he makes up words. He'd be like, all right, the word I'm going to use today is pebbles. And it's going to have like this meaning of like, oh, it's no big deal. It's not like a big rock. It's like small rocks. Pebbles. It's just pebbles. And I'm going to get all my kids to start saying it by the end of the day. That's like his whole shtick. It's hilarious.
So funny.
You should go find this guy.
You would do that.
100%.
That is 1,000%.
I love making up my own slang.
I always love it when someone's like, here's a word, can you work it into your sermon?
Oh, yeah.
Or here's a word, can you work it into like a transition in worship?
I'm like, so...
We should play that game.
I think for the podcast, it would be awesome.
I love being rogue.
Yeah. Probably not something that I enjoy doing in worship services, but... Yeah.
Someone help me.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well...
We got off to a great start here.
Anyway. So for those of you who are tuning in for the first time and have not listened to us yet, which you should, go back to the first episode, listen to what it's about. But we are going to dive a little bit into that right now.
Yeah.
Just the definition of worship, which is essentially the basis of this podcast. But can you talk about, like, will you define worship for all of us for me?
Yeah, I think we like to define worship here on this podcast the way Paul defines it, Romans chapter 12, verse 1. He says, he spends 11 chapters in his letter to the church in Rome defining the gospel, what the gospel was to the Jew and to the Gentile. And when he's done laying that all out for them, showing them how far the Lord has gone to bring them to salvation, to give them this free gift. He says in Romans chapter 12, verse 1, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God.
Yeah.
This is your spiritual act of worship." Or some translations say this is your true and proper or your right worship. And so for us, worship although we talk a lot about music because we're talking to worship leaders,
right.
and our modern culture has kind of put worship in that box, we look at worship as an expression of ourselves as we give ourselves to the Lord for his purpose. So anytime we bless the Lord, anytime we give the Lord what he is worth, from our life, that is worship. And we can worship a lot of things. Most people don't know this, but the word worship is a relatively new word.
Yeah, I want to talk about that. Tell us about the history of the word worship.
So that word didn't even actually exist until around the 1300s. It's a German word. It used to be pronounced as two different words, worth and ship. And they eventually would make it a conjunction. And so the idea is that you would ascribe value to someone or something. So if I thought, we do this all the time with subscription services, right? Somebody buys a subscription to Hulu or Netflix or Disney Plus or whatever,
or all of them.
Or all of them. You've determined it's worth something. You ascribe value to it. If it's not worth it, you cancel it. You keep your $6.99 or $17.99 a month or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So that is the idea of worth, that when we ascribe worth to something and then deliver on that worth to that thing, that is worship. And so over time, that German word became two words in Old English, and then it eventually became the word we use today, which is worship. We intentionally ascribe value or something to something, and then we deliver that value to that thing. So that is worship. Yeah.
That's epic. I did not know that.
Yeah, there you go.
I was not ready for a history lesson today, but I'm really excited I got one.
Yeah.
Never heard that before.
So you're going to see guys like Matt Redman and, my friend Grant Norsworthy, who we're going to talk to today. I'm really excited about him. They adopt this idea, and it's one I think is important for us because you hear me say this a lot. Everybody worships something.
Yeah.
And when you give value to something and you give yourself to that thing, you worship that thing. And so the idea isn't whether we should or should not pay for Hulu. The idea is, does it take priority over the thing we worship the most? So that's worship. Yeah.
Well, you said it. We're going to talk to Grant today, which I'm so stoked about because tell everyone who he is, because that'll help us dive into our next topic.
Yeah. So Grant Norsworthy is a really great friend of mine. We met, 8-9 years ago. It's kind of relatively recently for me. And we met at a worship conference in Orlando, Florida. We're sitting at a Chewy's with a friend of mine named Tim Otley. Tim was a media director at a church that I was a part of, and he was from Australia. And so we go and we're there with Grant, and who's also from Australia, and then a guy named Paul Coleman, who was a part of a band called the Paul Coleman Trio. All three of these guys are from Australia, so I got a chance to just kind of sit at dinner with them and just listen to them.
Some cool accents in one room.
What ended up happening is Grant and I sat right across from each other, and he began to speak to me about his, at that time, I think it was something that he was just trying to start, this More Than Music mentoring program, and really began to talk to me about his idea and his philosophy of worship. And as he's talking, I'm thinking, this guy's saying all the things that I think.
That's awesome.
I've never heard anybody express it the way I express it until I met Grant. So,
cool.
Come to find out, Grant used to be the bass player for a band called Sonic Flood.
Which is so cool.
Which is epic in my mind.
It's cool that he's from Australia, but that's the coolest part in my opinion.
Yeah. So, if you're a part of the worship music history, Sonic Flood was such a big part of moving the needle, I think in the mid 90s you had bands, like Hillsong, Matt Redman and Chris Tomlin kind of came on the scene. They were really kind of more in that kind of, praise era.
Yeah. Praise and worship. Yeah.
Matt Redman and I think, Chris Tomlin kind of helped bridge the gap there a little bit, but along comes this band called Delirious, who started to do things a little bit different.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Passion kind of pop up. They, for a long time, they were, I think, the 268 generation before they called themselves Passion.
Right.
But then here comes this band called Sonic Flood, like late 90s, early 2000s. And they just, it was like a whole different thing.
Oh, yeah.
And,
it was worship music that sounded like the rest of the world. It sounded like normal, not normal. You know what I'm saying? It sounded like normal music. I always wondered
why does church music sound so different than the rest of the music I listen to?
Well, I am sure we can get some opinions on that one.
And I don't, Tozer has this saying that, those who don't worship need to be entertained. Or, he talks a lot about how we want our worship to look different than what it looks like in the world. And I think it's important to understand that just because music is a language.
Right.
And we speak the languages we know. And so I always thought it was odd that the language I would speak in this circle over here looked a lot different than the music language I spoke when I walked through the doors of a church building.
Right.
And that never made sense to me.
Right.
So along comes Sonic Flood. And for the first time, I think in my life, I heard music that I would listen to in the car sound the same as music that I would sing in church.
Which I do think is also just a big deal for people who, like, you could think of now, like, I like this one style of music, but I'm feeling like if you're feeling convicted about listening to secular music and you only want to, like, move into listening to worship music, but I really love listening to this type of music.
Yeah.
These days you can search it on Spotify.
Yeah.
You can find, like, indie folk worship bands. You can find, like, I am a person who loves to work out to, like, Drake. Like, that's my jam. But I was feeling convicted about that for a while of
Probably
like,
should,
okay,
yeah.
my mental isn't great. Peace, love Drake. I love his music. But I was feeling like in a season of my life, I was like, I can't really be listening to Drake all the time. I was able to so easily go find Christian artists, like workout playlists, hardcore rap worship playlists, so that, like, I'm not getting junk in my mind, but it is the vibe of music that I want to listen to. That wasn't a thing.
No, and it wasn't. I love that about this era. I love hip hop music. And so I've got a really great friend named Adrian Butler. He's got a song called Let That Boy Worship, which I think is
so cool.
a jam.
He's one of the coolest people you'll ever meet.
But, like, I never understood why if you were to go to, I mean, name your artists, and these aren't, I don't think, super appropriate artists that people should be listening to, but Drake, Eminem,
vibes, but
right, Jay-Z.
Yeah.
And you're in an arena with all these people. They know every lyric.
Right.
And they're saying it along with the rap artist, right? And I could think about tons of hip hop songs that I know, where I know every lyric. And if I were sitting in front of that artist, like, I would be rapping along with them.
For sure.
That is a language that our culture speaks.
Right.
And I don't know what the threshold is for us to be able to say, this is the language we're gonna speak, to the Lord. And so I love a lot of these hip hop artists that are out there creating worship music right now,
which is wild.
That just looks so much different.
And I have seen, like, the argument is like, isn't that conforming? And I would argue that right back and say, like, there is a whole group of people that doesn't know Jesus, that are not going to listen to this, like, specific box of worship music. Yeah. But if it comes randomly on their radio, or, like, you share it on your Spotify and they're like, wait, what is this? Yeah. And, like, wait, this actually sounds cool. And they don't realize, like, the Lord's reaching out to them in that moment. And I think it's just touching a whole group of people that wouldn't know Jesus otherwise. Yeah. Because, like you said, music is a language. It speaks to people.
It does. You would never go to Africa and I don't know, pick your country in Africa. You would never walk into that place and just start speaking American ideas or Western ideas there that don't make sense to them, right? You would learn to speak their language. You would learn, if we're going to Europe to do mission work, I'm not going in talking about Americanized ideas. I'm really going to try hard to speak their language. And I think as we get into subcultures and subgenres, even in the world around us, and I think it's important to understand that there are languages that we all speak. There's slang that we all speak. And I think when we can understand that the Lord has the ability to speak to everybody in their language. This is what happened in Acts 2.
I was going to say, this is literally like the early church. This is exactly what
happened in Acts 2 when Peter began to preach and everybody understood him in their language, and they tried to blame it on things. You think
drunk.
about,
they must be drunk.
Right? Whatever it was. They came up with excuses to not hear it or to explain it away. But the truth is that God meets us where we are. And I think it's okay to speak back to God in the language that you have. And so I love this era where we're, hearing all these things. And I think that gets back to the idea of I'm giving God myself. This is who God made me. Beautiful. And I'm giving myself back to God. Beautiful. I don't have to conform to anything else in order to be anything but my authentic self to give to the Lord.
Right. So, and sometimes, and I have a love-hate relationship with it because it can be so cringy when people are like, this is me turning this secular song into a worship song.
Oh my goodness.
Sometimes I'm like, it gets really cringy.
You know what that reminds me of though? Okay, you're not old enough to remember this, but in the 90s there was this whole thing where, like, they would take, like, secular logos. Like Coca-Cola had one, their Coca-Cola logo, and underneath it'd say the real thing, you know, and somebody would take the Coca-Cola logo and turn
the
it into
t-shirts.
it'd be like Jesus Christ, the real thing, you know, or Pepsi had their slogan, Pepsi, the choice of a new generation, you know, like they would have Jesus, the choice of every generation.
It's so
like,
bad. No.
So to me, it's the same thing. You have all these like Christianese t-shirts, and now they're doing this to songs. So yeah.
It's like no one's saying this anymore, but it is chuggy. It just makes me like, or like when people were, if you wear these things, you are valued and you're loved and we're obsessed with it. It's a part of your brand. I might cringe at it, but you're amazing. When the Pick Jesus shirts and necklaces and everything was a guitar pick and it was like Pick Jesus and everyone's like, this is the dopest thing ever. I have one of those. Do you? Yeah. Dad. We got to talk.
It's probably in the bottom of my drawer, but I have one.
Not me remembering that, not knowing it was my dad wearing it.
Okay, so but the point is like we are often trying to conform secular things to the Lord, but I think the Lord wants to speak into the things of this world, right?
Oh,
he is not of this world. He wants to speak into the things of the world. And so I don't think it's a bad thing.
No.
Because it gives us the opportunity to express to the Lord what is from us, that we get to offer our bodies as living sacrifices.
And God is a creative God. Like,
for sure.
He's the creator. So obviously he is creative and he is where all of our creativity comes from. So why wouldn't he want us to be creative with what we're doing?
Yep.
So really quick before we're out of time, I want you to talk about some bands that like really influenced you. You are a rapper. Y'all may not know about this, about my little white dad, but he's a rapper. I want you to talk about when you started rapping, who your influences were in rap and in Christian worship music. Talk about it.
Okay, so I think we talked a lot about this in a couple episodes ago, but I mean, obviously DC Talk was huge. Like Tommy McKeon, hero of mine. Someday is a dream to have him on this podcast.
That'd be so cool. I saw you. I literally got to watch you meet him one time.
I've met him. Really cool. I've met him a few times,
and you got to tell him like, I named my son after you, which. It's so epic.
It is cool. So, I mean, DC Talk was huge. And I think the reason I love them so much is because I liked rap a lot when I was growing up, but none of it ever really felt like I could. It always felt like something that was like separated from the church. I didn't like that. I don't like being duplicitous. And so,
big word.
So, word. Yeah, there you go. So, there's the clean rappers out there like MC Hammer, and
clean being a relative word.
So I think, but when it comes to like Christian, like they were, I'm Beastie Boys, like, they're not Christian, but
they were like not.
Yeah. I have all their edited CDs.
All their edited CDs.
So anyway, so I love that. So like when I started hearing, artists like DC Talk, like it was awesome for me because I feel like, oh, here's a part of something I love that I can now do.
That's beautiful.
In this area of my life. And so that was huge. But then, I mean, I'm also a big rock and roll guy. My dad raised me on classic rock. So when those two things could join together, I mean, there was this big era in the mid 90s, early 90s where like they were taking hip hop beats and putting them in rock and roll music. And like, I love that kind of stuff. Yeah. So, like Linkin Park and, those type of bands were huge. But Sonic Flood, man, like Sonic Flood was huge for me. And
you mentioned Delirious,
Passion, Chris Tomlin. I think all those guys, when it comes to worship music, they really were the ones that kind of helped me jump from, what I was trying to accomplish to see something tangible, that we could really bring to the church. So, which
is like, it really did. They're pioneers. They paved the way for like my generation of having like Young and Free and having SCU Worship, who is killing the game right now, and having like even Maverick City, like doing things that sound like music I would listen to outside of worship music.
We just started doing an SCU song at church.
Oh, which one?
Called What a God.
Oh, that's so good.
What's crazy is I went into leading that one, and I even told my leadership, hey, I want to try something that's a little different than what we normally do. I don't know how this is going to go.
I love it.
And we did
Rock the boat.
And more than probably anything we've done in the last year, I've received more emails and comments in the hallway, people asking for the songs, you know, so like you never know what's going to resonate with people. And,
for sure.
But you're right. I mean, there's always those change agents. Who is the band? Who is the artist? Who are the people that are continuing to move us forward into speaking the language of our current generation?
Right.
Because what we want ultimately is for everyone to express their worship, to show God his worth and value in what we do in church. So,
and when there are these songs that are like sound like normal songs I'd listen to, and also like speak things that you're walking through.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like there was like almost like earlier, people didn't really say all the things, but now you have like songs coming out right now, like Elevation just dropped one that literally says words like fear and anxiety can't live here.
Yeah.
Where it's like people were not that bold when they were writing worship music, but because of these earlier 2000s bands that were like, no, let's talk about this, it like really paved the way for us to be able to worship about things that we're walking through. And I just think it's epic. So shout out.
Yeah. Shout out to guys like Grant.
Shout out Grant. I want to listen. I'm excited.
Yeah. Well, let's check it out because I think you guys are going to enjoy the opportunity to hear what Grant has to say today.
Let's do it.
Hey, welcome everybody to the RomansTwelveOne Podcast. I am really excited to introduce you to my guest today. This is Grant Norsworthy, and it's a fun name to say, but Grant, why don't you tell everybody who you are, why we know each other, and kind of what you've been doing for the last several years.
Oh gosh. Well, hello everybody. It's good to be with you, Tim. Thanks for having me. RomansTwelveOne. I love the title of your podcast. That's great. If I ever got a tattoo, it'd be RomansTwelveOne right here on my forearm, right there. I'm not going to do it. I'm
going to cut off your introduction here, but here's what I love. I have, over the last, probably 30 years, really dug into RomansTwelveOne as kind of my life verse. And you and I met in Orlando, Florida, I don't know, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, something like that. A mutual friend of ours, Tim Otley, was there. He's also from Australia. Paul Coleman was there, and you and we all sat down in this restaurant in Orlando to have dinner.
I think it was a Mexican.
I'm trying to remember. I think it was Chewy's. I think we were sitting at a Chewy's restaurant.
There you go.
And I remember thinking that because I'm like, man, we could get these in Texas or in Oklahoma. I'm not sure why we're eating this in Orlando, but anyway. But I remember Tim and Paul sat together, and you and I got a table right across from each other, and you started saying things about Romans 12 out loud that I had never heard anybody but myself express. And what I got really excited about that, I was like, me and Grant, we're going to be friends for a long time. So we've recently reconnected on another podcast, and I'm just really excited to have you here today. So,
thank you very much. Well, yes, it's true. I am Australian. I hope people are coping with my accent. And I spent a big chunk of my life growing up in Melbourne, Australia, but I was in a band with Paul Coleman, the guy that you just mentioned, Tim. And we were in a band called the Paul Coleman Trio, independently put out a few records in Melbourne, Australia, but we're all followers of Jesus, all three of us in the band, Paul, Phil, and myself. And we made that big leap in 2002, right after 9/11, actually. That's another whole story. 9/11 actually helped us get to America. Not many good things came out of 9/11, but one good thing was that we relocated to America. So we landed very early 2002 and put a couple of records out on Essential. That was the label name back then, and enjoyed a little bit of success. But we were there in that band right through that tumultuous, struggling change that was happening with music in the Christian church. And some people called it the worship wars. You and I hopefully agree that it was misnamed, but we weren't arguing 100%. Over worship. We were arguing over other things. But it was a really tough time. And I was a bass player, and I'd like to think I still am a bass player, although somewhat rusty. But when the Paul Coleman Trio finished, my wife, Brooke, and I decided to stay in the United States, and I found myself playing bass guitar in Sonic Flood, which was one of the bands that was known as like ushering in this new, what a lot of people called a revival or a reawakening to worship. They're not terms I would use, but I was the bass player in Sonic Flood. Now, understand this, listeners. Sonic Flood, hugely popular band.
Yeah, I don't know if any of our younger listeners.
Before I joined. I joined in. No, I don't know. But yeah, people don't remember Sonic Flood. Maybe I don't know, but it was a good time.
A few of our younger listeners may not recognize them, but I would say Sonic Flood did for what we would consider modern worship music. I think what DC Talk did for the Christian music industry. So I think y'all were pivotal to transforming modern worship today.
Yeah, well, and it's a bit of I don't think I can honestly say receive that you all, because it was guys who were in the band before I was that I think ushered in that massive change. But I was there as an observer. And then I found myself in the band for several years. Now, the crowds were still big, and I'm on one record that no one's heard. But I learned a lot about this music stuff and how people are using music as an expression of worship. Because I think that the good distinction to make is that the Paul Coleman Trio were primarily producing music and performing music that was for people to listen to. And we wanted it to show the worth of God. Like we were singing songs that were like stories or reflections or poetic sort of, pointing to the worth of God, to the worth of the cross of Christ. But most of the songs were designed to be listened to. And some of our fans would sing along if they knew the songs really well.
Of course.
And we had a song called Fill My Cup, which is our biggest hit. And the chorus of that at least was a prayer to God, fill my cup to the top with running water, call me out, show me how. And that would turn into much more of what we now might call much more of a getting everybody singing their prayer to God, because that's what Sonic Flood was all about. Get the people singing a prayer to God. And both can be worshipful, in my opinion. Yep. Both can be reflections of what Romans 12:1 is about. And offer yourself as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, and let that be your spiritual, reasonable, intelligent act of worship. But one of the ways we wanted to do that in the Paul Coleman Trio was sing songs for people to listen to. And in Sonic Flood, we wanted to present songs that people would sing their own prayer to God or their own praise of God. And it was just sort of a slightly different thing. And I was on both sides of that. And I think it gave me a really fascinating perspective on what's happening on Sunday mornings for the churches of our listeners.
Well, that's what I love about you and what you can bring to this platform, because I think you have a perspective that's unique. You've seen kind of both sides of the coin. Obviously you and I got to live through kind of this monumental transition in Christian music. And then we got to see the birth of the modern worship era, and I think you have a perspective that I'm really excited for people to dig into. Talk a little bit about, you quoted Romans 12:1 perfectly. Talk a little bit about that. How do you define worship? If music is just an expression of worship, what is worship?
Yeah, I even struggle with the just an expression of worship, because my sense of the value of people of the Christian faith gathering together and singing prayers to him, to God, singing reminders of truth about God, praising God, encouraging each other to follow Jesus more intentionally, especially through songs. My assessment of the value of that as one of the expressions of worship is going up, not down.
That's
not
awesome.
Down. It's going up. And in fact, that's a lot of what I do with this thing called More Than Music Mentor. We might talk about that later. But how do I define worship? Well, I'm an Australian bass player. It's got to be simple. So to worship God, to me, simply is to show the worth of God.
Yeah.
That's it. To ascribe value to the cross of Jesus the Christ. In fact, the word worship used to be said worthship. Didn't exist in our English language as worship. That's about 300 years old, that use of it. So, and it used to only be a verb, worthship. And here's the thing. We are all constantly worthshipping stuff, things. The easiest idol for Grant Norsworthy to worship is myself, right? So, and a lot of the times the worshipper of an idol, they don't think of themselves as being an idolater. They think they're a worshipper, right?
Yes.
So there's some self-delusion that can happen here. So everything in my humanity, I want to shrink what it means to worship God. I want to make it smaller and smaller and smaller and have it fit into my busy lifestyle, right? Yes, if you ask people of the Christian faith, do you want to worship God? They're all going to say, absolutely, yes. But what we do is we say yes, but on my terms.
Wow.
Yes,
yeah.
but I'll make it fit into an hour and a half on Sunday morning. Yes, but only if I get to do this as well. Yes, and so we see through the scriptures a lot of times when people are worshiping idols, right? So you have to have a definition in your own head of worship that allows for the worship of an idol. So worship of God is to show the worth of God, but the worship of Grant Norsworthy is me ascribing value to myself,
Yeah.
And this is why I think we're left with Romans 12:1. And this is why it burns a hole, Tim, in your and my soul, because we don't really want to know this. But the worship that God requires of us is to offer ourselves as a living sacrifice. Yeah. And there's this enormous paradox there. Living, I get to be alive. My heart beats, blood courses through my veins. I get to breathe. I'm alive. Thank you, God. And Jesus actually promises that he comes to give us life and life to the full.
Yes.
Hallelujah. But paradoxically, the worshipper will offer himself as a sacrifice. A sacrifice has to die. This is a very real death. I get to live, but I have to die. So to worship God is to show the worth of God, and I have to swim into that paradox of how do I use the life that God has given me to his glory and his glory alone? How do I die to live? How do I offer myself as a living sacrifice? How do I have more of who Jesus is by his Holy Spirit coursing through me? Because the blockage to God himself coursing through Grant Norsworthy is Grant Norsworthy, the counterfeit me, the fake me, But God wants me to be the man, the person, the worshiper that he's created me to be. And I haven't arrived yet. I'm still struggling to die to live,
Yeah. I think that's the process for all of us. But I mean, I think that's what I loved about sitting down with you at the table that night is it was a very clear, you and I had a very similar vision of what worship is, that we've confined it to this very small thing that we do. And I don't mean to say music is small, but in comparison to the life that we are supposed to give up for the Lord, it's just a piece of it, and to listen to you define it that way, I've always really appreciated. And,
thanks for saying that, Tim. But, I feel a little bit of a fraud being on this podcast because, you've asked Gen Z worship leaders, and I don't think of myself as being a worship leader. Yes, I can play guitar. I can get in front of a congregation. I have the ability to sing okay, and I can choose some songs and I can present them to a congregation and ask them to worship God through the songs. But I can't make anyone worship.
No, I think you're right. And I think
it's an encounter with God that makes someone worship him, right?
Right. But I think that's our part as leader. We've talked about this in previous podcasts, is that the idea of worship leader has two titles, that we worship and that we lead. We have been called to a responsibility to connect people to the Lord and help them encounter the Lord in a way that their outpouring is themselves, I think what you're talking about, though, a lot of worship leaders may not consider themselves worship leaders because they just play guitar in the band, or they just play drums, or they just run the camera on Sunday morning, or an audio. One of the things we like to talk about on our worship team a lot is that everybody's a worship leader. It is all of our responsibility to make sure that we eliminate whatever is in the way so that people can encounter the Lord in such a way that they give up themselves with the rest of the congregation. And I think that definitely makes you a worship leader. So.
Okay. Yeah, I don't stop people calling me that, But I guess a really important part of my story, though, is connecting these dots, which is, if it's true that the mouth speaks and this is just my story, okay? You're asking me for my story. But if it's true that our mouths speak what our heart is full of, if it's true that our lives are steered by our tongues like a ship is steered by a rudder, if it's true that it's not by what goes into my mouth but what comes out of my mouth that I'll be acquitted or condemned, if it's true that the way I speak makes a difference, and if it's true that I can delude myself and think I'm a worshiper when I'm actually an idolater, then why would I unteach myself This because I think it is this serious. Why would I unteach myself the deeper Romans 12:1 meaning of worship? Why would I continue to cultivate a language that says, I didn't like worship last Sunday. I'm going to go to a different church where the worship's better. You know, the worship, I'm going to send a text message to the pastor because the worship was no good. No, the guitar was too loud and the camera shot was not quite right and the lighting was way off. You know, like we have turned even the worship of God into a commodity that most worshipers think they get to assess whether it was any good or not. But the worship of God is only biblically, as I understand it, from the created to the creator, or worship can be from the created to an idol. But if you can't talk about this deeper understanding of worship, then you cannot think about it. And if you cannot think about it, you cannot live it. And if you cannot live it, you will always read Romans 12:1, obviously as a living sacrifice, and you won't swim into the mystery. That's my story. So
I love that. I think that was part of the hard part of going through the quote unquote worship wars that we got to be a part of is you felt like there were these lines being drawn in the sand that if it's not my way, then I won't have anything to do with it, which is the exact opposite of worship, you know? And I wouldn't even point that finger at any one group. I think it was everyone. Yeah. We were all saying, this is how I want it. And this is what I want to do. And this is how I bless the Lord. But being able to do that as a congregation actually means giving up ourselves even a little bit more, because we're not only giving up ourselves for the Lord, we're giving up ourselves for his people so that his people can bless the Lord. And, you know, people were really struggling with that.
Yeah, we're selfish beings. And the biggest distraction to worshiping God is the worship of self.
Say that again, man.
The biggest distraction to the worship of God is the worship of self. And if we, Tim, you and I, with microphones, with audiences, with podcasts, use the word to mean actually it's what happens, the experiences you get when music is used in a church service. It's the way we use music in this hour and a half or 2 hours or an hour on Sunday. That's the worship. We teach that. Yep. We don't mean to teach that because I know, Tim, I know you well enough. You want to teach Romans 12:1 worship. Yep. But we have to understand we unteach that. I believe that most people who are sincere followers of Jesus, who attend churches and they want to worship God with all that they are, and they want to worship God in spirit and in truth, that 99 times to 1, they hear the word worship used to mean something that you and I know it's not.
Right.
How would we be surprised then? We should not be surprised. So when we find out that people aren't worshiping God on Tuesday when they're having an affair, or Thursday night when they're ripping people off in business, or you know what I mean? Because I didn't come to this podcast wanting to tell you this, but I was in Sonic Flood, right? Worship band Sonic Flood, worship songs, leading worship, the forefathers of the modern worship revival. And I was on the platform singing these songs. I could sing If You Love Forever, raising my hands, weeping, people coming forward, praying, people falling over. Like it was an exciting time. But in the tour bus, feeling lonely, feeling depressed, feeling anxious, feeling misunderstood, I would look at porn in my tour bus bunk. I needed to know that God was there too. I needed to know that I was also a worshiper then. I needed to know that God was present and he loved me and he could meet my needs. I didn't need to worship that idol, right?
Yep.
But I needed to know, and every one of our listeners, you need to know that the worship of God does not switch on and switch off when someone hangs a guitar around their neck and starts singing a song and starts projecting lyrics. This is an important expression of worship. And some of us have experience of God's presence during those times. Some of us don't. But whether you have those experiences or whether you don't, to offer yourself as a living sacrifice is 24/7, 365 and 366 on a leap year. Right?
Yeah, because God is everywhere. I think this is one of those things that you just touched on. In theology circles, we call this omnipresence, right? Like it's a fancy word that we like to use, but literally means God is everywhere. I think we've fallen into this trap, and you hear it come out in worship lyrics a lot, where we call on the Lord's presence to enter the room. And when we say those things, I think we get this false idea that somehow God is not present. And when we speak these words, or we say these right things, or we quote these scriptures as if there's some kind of incantation, that it brings God into the room. But the truth is that God is everywhere. He's right there with you on that platform. He's right there with you on that tour bus. He's right there with you when you're driving your car and that guy cuts you off in traffic. He's right there with you in all of those moments. And who we give ourselves to, or what we give ourselves to in those moments, determines where our worth lies. And I think that ultimately is where we worship.
Right. And I'm pleased to be able to tell you that God radically healed me from that addiction that I mentioned before, and that's part of my journey as well, that this is the language that I've come up around this because not only have I lived in 3 different countries, not only have I done a lot of traveling, not only have I lived a long life. I'm old, right, folks? I'm pretty old. I've seen a lot of changes in this thing.
If you weren't old, you wouldn't be on this podcast.
Right. There was this thing that was called a charismatic renewal to many people that was wrapped around this change in music. And I lived from both sides of that. And I consider myself a charismatic person, but I don't think that the charismatic displays or even evidence of the manifest presence of God in a church gathering is proof that worship is better than people who aren't that charismatic, that aren't seeing healings or falling over or hands in the air. So I can't judge the human heart. Only God can. So this is why I don't actually think and don't use the word the way I think you do too, and this is not trying to be better than you. This is really helpful to me. If to worship God is to offer myself as a living sacrifice, then if we gather together, some people focus on having an experience of God's presence when we gather together, and other people want to deepen their theological, doctrinal reverence for God. Some of the church have an emphasis on experiencing God. Some of the church have an emphasis on knowing God, and both are important. This actually makes me think of something we can read in 1 Corinthians 1:22, which says, the Jews demand signs and wonders, but the Greeks want wisdom.
Yes.
And it follows on from there to say, but I preach Jesus. And so here's my experience of the Christian church. There are some people who are more of the Pentecostal charismatic flavor. They want to have evidence of God's manifest presence. They know that God is omnipresent, but they are hoping to experience God's manifest presence. I'm a fan of that. That can be good, but don't worship your experiences of God's manifest presence. And here's the shift in language, I would say, because if you say it's the worship leader's job to bring people into the presence of God, then you are actually using language that says that church, you don't experience God's presence the way we do. He's actually not there.
Right.
And that's divisive. That's Greeks and Jews. That's we're better than you. So let's preach Jesus, shall we?
Yeah.
Let's just do this. Let's say, well, we have found in our flavor of church, if we use music in particular ways, we can become more aware of God's presence.
Yeah.
Rather than making him come through the ceiling.
Love it.
You know what I mean? Because then I can say these people become deeper in their reverence for God as they use music, because those people, they want to have more meaty poetry in their lyrics. And I've found that those people who are sometimes Presbyterians or they might be Lutherans or they might be Reformed in some way, they bring a piece to this puzzle of who is God. This
is where Paul takes Romans 12. This is where Paul takes Romans 12, right? We're all members of one body, and each part has its purpose. This is the function of the church.
But please understand my Pentecostal, right? Please understand my Pentecostal charismatic brothers and sisters. Resist using language that suggests that you are somehow a superior worshiper to someone who doesn't have the same experiences as you. Because when someone says God inhabits the praises of his people, and I know who I'm quoting saying that, but I don't believe that is a correct quote. God is not in the voices of the people. He is not. He is omnipresent. Now, we hear cool people that we respect say that, and it sounds so effective. And I've heard it a million times said from a platform. And usually it's a more Pentecostal charismatic leader who says it, and they say it, part one, because they've heard someone else say it and it sounded cool.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, they say it because they want to get people more excited and engaged and vibrant. I get that, but don't misquote scripture to do it. God is not inside the praises of the people. Say this, let's sing together. Let's sing because the Bible tells us to sing together. And let's see if God softens the barrier between us and him this morning. Let's sing, shall we? Say something.
Or as David said, come let us bless the Lord together. Right?
Let's do that. I'm excited, but don't use language that suggests that people who have a different theological emphasis than you don't know God.
Right.
They know God. They know that God is omnipresent. They know that the Spirit has been given. They know they are filled with the Holy Spirit. They just bring a different emphasis.
One of the analogies that I love using is the analogy of a family. I'm the oldest of 5 kids, and I have 5 kids of my own. And what's really cool is doing this podcast with my daughter. Yeah, right. We have a basketball team basically, but what's awesome for me as a dad is knowing that at any point in time, any one of my kids could come and bring me a gift for Father's Day or Christmas, or just because they want to tell me they love me, and I would love that gift. But the meaning when all of my kids get together and decide to do something for me as all of my kids, I know that what I would do with my daughter, or what I would do with my oldest son, or what I would do with my middle son, those all look radically different. So when they come together and they decide to bless their dad, they all have to give up a part of themselves in order to do that together, you know? And I try to look at the church that way, that at some point we're all just brothers and sisters. We're all a part of this really big family, and it's going to require all of us to give up a little bit of something so that together we can bless the Father in heaven. And I mean, to your point, it takes all of us, or we're just individual worshipers. We're not the body of Christ worshiping together.
Yep. I love that. I love that analogy, because wouldn't it be weird though, Tim, if one of your kids brought a gift to you and then they went to their brothers and sisters and your wife going, my gift to dad is the best gift that he received. The way I give dad gifts is superior to yours. That takes away the joy, because only you get to decide whether the gift was to your liking, right?
Yep.
And we've got to realize that it's us humans, and this has been a problem since Cain and Abel, by the way. Anyone who knows Old Testament stuff, arguing over whose worship is better. I mean, that turned into murder back then.
Right.
Now, today it turns into church splits. Not quite so serious.
Yes.
But so we have to, with some fear and some trembling, but also joy, offer the worship to God that we want to offer him, and let God decide how worshipful he found it. You know what I mean? Don't use language that suggests that my worship or our churches or this way, if you use these sort of songs, or if it's this loud, or if you know, because I hear that all the time, all the time. That's not really worshipful unless the songs refer to God in the second person, you. It's not really worship unless I agree with the theology. It's not really worship unless people are having an experience of God's manifest presence. Yeah. Well, it's not really worship if it came from that church. If those songwriters from that church wrote it, it can't be worship. Ooh. It's like, why don't you just say you don't want to sing that one?
Yeah,
you know,
at least that would be honest, right?
Right.
I think this is the conversation Jesus was having when he watched the Pharisees. I want to say Luke 21. Jesus watched the Pharisees put in their tenth, right? But then the lady, she puts in her, and I think he says something like, "The poor widow has put in more than all the others," you know, because she gave out of her poverty, and. You know, but there they were looking down on her, saying, "Oh, she didn't give a tenth of what she had," and they thought their worship was better than hers. But she gave out of everything she had.
Exactly, and you might know where this is. I don't know where this is, but you know, Jesus actually says to the Pharisees, and he quotes Isaiah when he says this: "They worship in vain."
Yeah,
like the group of people who were alive during Jesus' time while he was on earth. In bodily form. Excuse all my extra words, guys, listeners. I'm really careful with how I speak because I want to point myself towards the truth. because I believe Jesus is alive today, right?
Yes, yes.
So the people, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the religious leaders, you know what they were saying to everybody? We worship God superior to you. You need to be more like us to be worshippers. And Jesus says to them, you worship in vain. Now, I think we can easily be exactly the same today.
Yeah.
You know, like our worship's better than those people. Our worship's better than those people. No, let God measure what he finds worshipful.
We all like to think that we're the woman putting in the 2 coins, right? Like we all like to put ourselves in her position.
I know,
but,
I do.
You know, I know. I mean, I think we have to sometimes do a gut check and realize, like, sometimes we fall on the side of the Pharisee, you know, where the way we treat people. And the thing about that is, Jesus never really condemned their method. He condemned their heart behind the method. You know, he didn't say, "Oh, you shouldn't give a tenth." He said, "You gave out of your wealth, but she gave out of her poverty." You know, she gave all she had when she didn't have anything. And, you know, you're standing here excited because you were able to give 10% and you think you're superior. So, you know, for Jesus, it's always a hard issue. And we should not look across any kind of aisle, whether it be, denominational or, you know, whatever, and just assume that our worship is better because we have a different relationship with the Lord than those people over there. You know,
we're all like broken pieces of pottery.
For sure.
We're all like broken pieces of pottery, and it's only the artist's hand that can bring us together to be a beautiful mosaic. And we need each other. We need the other pieces of broken pottery. You know, the Bible verse that kicked me across the room, Romans 12:1 kicked me across the room, but another one is James 1:26. And if your listeners are looking for some practical thing to apply in their own lives, this is just me telling my story. This is what happened to me. James 1:26 says, if anyone considers themselves religious, yet does not keep a tight run on his tongue, he deceives himself and his religion is worthless. But the Greek word thraskia, I might be saying it incorrectly, sorry, Bible scholars. Thraskia is translated as religion and religious in James 1:26. And like the word awesome has been overused and misused and changed in its meaning, so is the word religion and religious, right? Like I don't think of myself as being a religious person. Do you, Tim?
No. That's a whole nother podcast.
Right. But anyway, so very generally speaking, even Christians, I've heard sermons. We're not religious. We're followers of Jesus.
Right. We have a relationship. You know? Yes. It's not a religion. It's a relationship. Yeah.
Because religion in 2024, when we're recording this podcast, is only ever used as a negative descriptor. Right. Someone's religious. Someone's morally feels like they're morally superior. Someone's got their own system to earn their own acceptability to God. Well, the Greek word thraskia, I think today is better translated like this. If anyone considers himself a worshipper, yet does not keep a tight run on his tongue, he deceives himself and his worship is worthless. So when I reached that translation of James 1:26, a verse that prior to that I thought was about telling dirty jokes or swearing or maybe lying or, you know, I realized, like, why would I say wasn't worship good this morning? When I had a great experience during the music of a church service, that kicked me across the room. So I decided to change the way I use the word worship. I don't think of myself as being a quote unquote worship leader. I do this rabbit ear fingers thing quite a bit in emails and documents and articles.
Air quotes.
And air quotes is so cheesy, it's terrible. But and it's very hard for me because I live in this circle. I say sung worship. I say singing as an expression of worship because I want to remind myself. I don't want to deceive myself and think that my worship is worshipful to God. James 1:27 also kicked me across the room. Just after we've read, if anyone considers himself a worshipper yet does not keep a tight run on his tongue, he deceives himself and his worship is worthless because pure and perfect worship in the sight of God, says James 1:27, is elevation, Bethel, passion, and Hillsong.
Not what it says.
No, it doesn't say it. It says Geddes. It says Geddes. No, it doesn't say that either. Pure and perfect worship in the sight of God is to care for orphans and widows in their trouble and remain uncorrupted by the world. And the world that Tim, you and I would move in, the world that our listeners move in, is a world that says you're a worship leader if you've got a little bit of musical ability and can stand in front of a crowd of people and choose some songs for them to sing together that are actually prayers to God or reminders of truth about God. And you've worshipped if you have a great experience, or if your theology was expanded, or So I'm trying to keep it tight on my tongue, and I come across as all weird. I'm okay with it.
I think I joke that my personality, and I think you fall in this category too. You can disagree with me if you want, but my personality is such that if I try too hard, I just come across as passive aggressive. Yeah. When really I'm just trying to be kind and and keep a tight rein on my tongue.
The last thing I want you to hear from me, Tim, and the last thing I want your listeners to hear is I'm being finger waggy, you know?
Yeah, I know.
Like
this is why I wanted everybody to hear you.
Yeah, word usage isn't my passion. I'm not trying to say I'm superior to you. I'm just telling my story. This was an amazing catalyst for change for me.
What I love about you is you are intentional about your passion of worship. And that means having a right focus and a right dialogue and a right teaching of what worship is. And there's nothing wrong with coming together and singing songs. That is an expression. It can be worship. But that is not the entirety of worship. And you've worked really hard, I think, to demonstrate that for us right now, and have as long as I've known you, and probably even longer. So I appreciate that about you. Yeah. Tell me a little bit about, Go ahead.
No, I think I'm liking what you're going to ask, because I think it's where I want to go. Go ahead.
I was going to say, tell me about your worship mentor program and More Than Music. And if that's not where you wanted to go, I can edit here and we can slide it to the.
That's it, man. That's it. Because here is the beautiful irony for me, and I know what I've called the ministry work I do is a bit of a mouthful, but for your listeners, More Than Music mentor. Too many words. It's not a great marketing choice, but there it is. More Than Music mentor. And I provide online and on-site training for the heart and the art of worshiping musicians. Heart and art, in case you're American and didn't understand that. Heart and art.
And art.
Okay. Heart and art of the worshiping musician. Yeah, so it's called More Than Music Mentor. You can find out more at morethanmusicmentor.com. And here's the irony. Like, my passion, as I said before, my passion to help the church use music more effectively as an expression of worship has gone up, not down. So More Than Music Mentor really is all about trying to help the church use music better. You know, whether that be tiny little churches with amateur volunteers, you know, they got, you know, someone playing the tambourine and a guitar and 3 singers, you know, or whether it's like the mega church, you know, like with everything, all the bells and whistles and backing tracks and click tracks and, you know, whatever else, and live pitch correction and 17 cameras and, you know, like smoke and lights. Rock on.
Why do I feel attacked right now?
No, dude. It's all right.
I know. I'm being
it's
funny.
All right. No. There's a huge wide range, but I'd like to think I can meet churches where they're at and help them. But I've found that there are 2 huge first steps with More Than Music Mentor that I've been doing this for like 18 years now, and it took me a while to realize that there is a massive amount of confusion in the church about what it means to worship God on the first hand. And secondly, what is the role of music in a church gathering? Massive confusion. So a lot of More Than Music Mentor is to teach those first 2 steps. Because when I wasn't teaching those first 2 steps, I would hear things like, well, I can't worship God unless I'm singing high. No, I need to be able to play the drum beat the way I want to play it and just play how I feel, to be spirit-led. Otherwise, it's not worship. I would hear, if it's a rock band with electric guitars, it's not worship. Well, no, it can't be worship unless you're singing to God in the second person you. If you're singing about him, that's not worship.
Yeah.
So all of these uses of the word worship make it a nightmare to teach, because whether you realize it or not, listeners, the way you understand what actually needs to be achieved in the room when music is involved in a church gathering, what you're shooting for may not be what people in your congregation are shooting for, may not be what half your band is shooting for. You might have a different understanding of that from your senior pastor.
Yeah.
So we've got to get everyone on the same page there.
Yep.
Then we can move through the other things, like what sort of songs we choose, what sort of key should they be in, what, how should we sing them? How do we play them? How should we mix this? Should we have light? Should we have the congregation in the dark? I said, well, you're getting bogged down in what and how issues before you know why you have music in the first place.
Right.
And what does it mean to worship God? But if we can get everyone on the same page with what it means to worship God, Romans 12:1 mainly.
Yeah.
And then, well, why do we have music? When people of the Christian faith, when our church gathers, why do we have music involved? Let's find agreement there. And I've got a way of talking about that I think is really, really needed. And the way I talk about it, I'd like to think crosses over those we want to experience God right down to we want to know God. Also that we want new songs, we want old songs, we want spontaneity, we want structure. We want I and God and me, just a personal connection with him through the song. Or no, this is all of us together, or this is a corporate thing. Those are the issues that churches split over. Those are the issues that churches argue over. And I am not wanting to add fuel to any new misnamed quote-unquote worship war. Let's wave the white flag. Let's declare peace. Let's find unity and agreement on, number one, what it means to worship God. Number two, why do we have music in a gathering? And then you can read your room. And if you've got 3,000 people who are super excited every Sunday morning, you must make different choices from the person who's got 37 people in a living room.
Yes.
If you're 300 people at a Baptist church with about 60% people with silver hair like mine, you will have to make different vocal, instrumental, and technical choices than the youth group of 200 kids who are all 16, 17, 18. You have to read your room and use music that's right to serve your people, because we want to facilitate them connecting with God and with each other through the songs. And what I see over and over again is people not reading the room right.
Yeah.
Misreading the room.
Well, dude, I know you. I know you're working hard at helping connect people to those ideas and all the great things that you're doing. I really, really want to encourage, if you're listening to this and you're a young worship leader who's looking for an opportunity to connect with somebody who has a depth and an understanding of what biblical worship is, I encourage you to check out Grant at morethanmusicmentor.com. And what I know this about Grant, he will spend time with you. And he loves talking about this. He's very passionate. And thank you, Grant, for doing this with me today. I think you bring a great perspective, a much needed perspective to the worship platform. So very thankful for you.
Thank you, Tim. It's been great to be with you. Thanks, mate.